Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Differential Understanding. This is your host, Grace Xiao. I also write the newsletter AI Proem on Substack, where I cover AI, APAC, and the companies sitting at the intersection of software, hardware, and industrial change. So do check that out. Today, I'm joined by Tu Li, founder and managing director of Sino Auto Insights. He authors the SAI Weekly Substack and co-hosts the China EVs and More and At the Wheel podcast, who is one of the sharpest observers of China's EV and mobility industry. He has worked across Detroit, Silicon Valley, and China, so he views the industry through a very unique lens, through the traditional auto industry, the tech industry, and the Chinese market from the inside. I wanted to do this episode almost as an educational primer, and not just for you, but for myself selfishly as well. Most people now understand that Chinese EVs are competitive, but I think few people understand why and how that is translated into physical AI. So today, I want to walk through the EV landscape, why traditional OEMs struggled, what technologies actually matter, how autonomous driving fits in, and why home appliance and smartphone companies like Huawei, Xiaomi, and Dreame are suddenly making cars. Hi, Tu. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to have you on.
Thanks for having me on, Grace.
Yeah, to start, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? We were just having this conversation right before recording hit. I find your background really fascinating. You said, you can talk to a very diverse group of kind of people. You run a successful consulting gig, a consulting company. Tell us about everything that you do.
So, name is Tu Li. I'm the managing director at Sino Auto Insights. I also create content, I co-host two podcasts, China EVs and More, and At the Wheel, with my co-hosts that are very, very good at what they do as well. And then I write a weekly newsletter, almost weekly anyways, called Sino Auto Insights Weekly, that just kind of goes over my thoughts on what's happening in the industry now globally every week. And I'm actually not Chinese, I'm Vietnamese. And I was born in Vietnam and moved to the United States when I was a year old and grew up right outside of Detroit. My whole family, youngest of 8, whole family's automotive. So grew up car kid and did that for a few years before going back to grad school and moving to Silicon Valley to work for 7 years. So that's where the knowledge of the tech comes in, especially the hard tech, where hardware software integration is such an important part of creating a great user experience. And then I met a girl, and in San Francisco, my girlfriend, who's now my wife, was transferred by her company over to Beijing, where she was born. And I decided to pull the ripcord and follow her over. And what we thought was going to be 3-4 year assignment ended up being 13. And during this time, I worked in automotive. I worked at a few Chinese EV e-commerce startups. And so that's when I learned and experienced 996 myself for about 2 years. And yeah, it's not fun, super intense. But again, I wouldn't trade those experiences for the world because it gives me the perspective that I have now. About 8 years ago, I saw this huge disconnect because EVs were becoming a thing because of Tesla. Companies like NIO and XPeng had just been founded. And, in Beijing, as you know, Grace, there's a lot of the German OEMs. And so there was a bit of arrogance about how hard or how simple they thought software was and really being consumer focused as opposed to product focused. So I saw this opportunity and I started this consultancy, Sino Auto Insights. And, we've been growing since. We've done traditional work. We've worked with UK government, US government on things. And then also when I moved back 4 years ago from Beijing, and I left during COVID. So August of 2022, and then November, December timeframe, China opens its border and says, "What COVID? Come on in." So we didn't know that was going to be the case. So we decided to move back, and we opened an office here in just outside of Detroit, and we've been helping more on the investment side, looking for investment opportunities, what's around the corner, but also giving our clients a better understanding of the Chinese EV players and the battery players and what they're doing outside of China. So it's a very, very interesting time. The mobility space, as you know, Grace, involves now AI, silicon, data centers, data privacy, data security, batteries. So it's just a tremendously unique sector that I get to be a part of.
Thank you so much for sharing your life story. First of all, kudos to your mother. 8 kids. Like, I don't know how she did that. Like, I have two and I'm already dying. And also, I love your personal touch, why you moved to Beijing and just learning about your background. I think it's super fascinating. You pointed one thing out. Like, when I was living in Beijing and Shanghai as well, I met a lot of German OEM like employees, and people kind of low key don't know this, that there's a huge German community
Huge.
in the huge, like, and French as well. A lot of Europeans are actually working in China for these, especially luxury vehicle companies. And a lot of them did relocate out of China during COVID times. And a lot of them I've heard, even anecdotally through two friends who say like they're dying to get back because they're really bored in Munich or bored in Frankfurt just
We
because they're
hear those
so
stories
used.
a lot, don't we, Grace? We hear those stories a
Right.
lot.
It's just because it's just a fast paced energy in China. However, okay, COVID was crazy. China's fast paced. Let's get to the actual topic today. I want to talk about EVs. I want to learn everything from you. So, before we get started, when we think of Chinese EVs, most people outside of China think of BYD. Think of maybe like the few other ones you mentioned, like Neo, Xpeng, now Xiaomi, Dreame, which is crazy. Essentially, these home appliance companies are going into the space as well. There are state-owned companies, there are old independent automakers, there are startups that we just talked about, and then some of them also produce batteries. Some of them are, like I said, home appliance and phone companies. Basically, all of these different moving parts, they're all coming into the same arena. Help us map out the industry first. Like, to start with, who are the main players? What are the buckets? What does each group bring to the table, or what's their differentiating kind of offering? I know this is a very big
So
question, but start with a big picture.
Well, let me press rewind and kind of frame it and create more context as opposed to just we'll zoom out and then we'll zoom into the China market. So last year, 2025, Toyota was the number one global automaker, 11 million units, around 11, just over 11 million units. Volkswagen was number two at 8 million. To give you a sense of scale, Tesla was 1.6 million units and BYD was around 4.6, which makes them a top 10 automaker. The other top 10 automaker for the Chinese was Geely. Geely and everybody else outside of BYD and Tesla build ICEs and EVs, or in China, they call them NEVs, new energy vehicles, which means that they're battery electric vehicles plus plug in hybrids, EREVs, and then fuel cells. So, fuel cells, for our intents and purposes, is a rounding error. So, when we talk NEVs, we're talking battery electric and plug in hybrids and extended range electric vehicles. So Toyota's been number one for a long, long time. And, you know, the China market has been the number one passenger vehicle market since 2009, overtaking the United States. And now the China market is almost twice as big as the US market. If we add the European market, which is around 12.5, 13 million units, and the US market, which is around 15.5, 16 million units, it's almost the same as China. And so the scale of the China market is enormous. And so to talk about EVs specifically, I would create different sets of buckets. And I would look at BYD, Chery, Geely, Great Wall as separate companies, SAIC, because they produce in the millions of units. Okay. And then this lower tier, I won't say lower, but this other tier of EV makers, the Neos, the Xpungs, the Li Autos, the Zeekrs, these are companies specifically that Western investors pay attention to because they're traded publicly in the US. They're in the
One
hundreds of
comment on
thousands
this.
of units. Go ahead. Yep.
So you're actually separating them by the number of units versus their technology, because it seems like just not like SAIC, they're actually traditionally an OEM company, but they're not also producing EVs, whatnot. So you're actually categorized by number of sales versus, I guess, I don't know, EV native like Neo and Xpeng. Just help us
So it
understand why that industry does that.
So the automotive industry is very capital intensive, and so scale creates cost efficiencies. Okay, so if I buy 10 of something versus one of something, I'm going to get a better price, generally speaking, and that's why it's so important that BYD have this enormous scale, 4.6 million units, and that's through the traditional lens. Now, it's multi-layered, as you'd mentioned. They're EV only companies that we can talk about, but from the standpoint of scale and global reach, that's where I'm really creating these separations, because scale also creates flexibility, because it's going to be harder for a company that only sells 300,000 units of anything to go global, as opposed to someone that sells 4.6 million units of something. Because these companies, the BYDs, the Geelys, the Leap Motors, they all already ship and build and manufacture outside of China. Big steps. And so those are really kind of the uniqueness to some of those top level guys that have the sales volume. They have the ability to go abroad, because think of it just from a numbers standpoint, Grace. If we have capacity of half a million units, you and I run a car company, building a 150,000 unit factory is a huge consideration for us, because we have to find demand somewhere for that 150,000 units. Whereas if you have millions of units, 150,000 units isn't that huge in the grand scheme of things of sales and distribution. And so that's where it's a little bit easier for these larger companies to really command, the pricing scale that they can can negotiate over some of those smaller players. But back to kind of how I would look at this. The Neos, the Xpungs, the Li Autos, they're publicly traded in the US. That's why there's a lot of attention paid to them. But they're still puppies. And all of them shipped less than 500,000 units last year. Now, Xiaomi is one of the newer players, but it is making a huge impact, because their automotive division, and you and I think were there when Xiaomi first was founded in 2010 in Beijing, but their automotive division is less than 6 years old. And this year they'll ship over 500,000 units. Contrast that with the Neo and Xpeng, who have been around since 2014, 2015, who are barely shipping 500,000 units. So that tells you kind of the impact Xiaomi has had. Xiaomi only has two products. Neo and Xpeng have 4, 5, 6 products. And so now with Huawei, I would pull them into a very unique budget, because they don't build any cars. What they do is partner with other OEMs, whether they're state owned or non state owned, and offer the hardware software stack. Okay. And they call it HEMA, which is the Harmony in Mobility Alliance. And so there are companies like, when you hear about Ito, Maestro, Stellato, Luxeed, I won't talk about who their partners are, but these are all using Huawei technology. And more, there are foreign companies that are using Huawei technology. So Audi, I think Mercedes is using some of the Huawei technology in the China market. So we get into a lot of crossover when it comes to Huawei, because in order for Huawei to really legitimize their tech stack, they probably need more foreign automakers to sign up to it. And they've been really aggressive on trying to scale that part of the business, because once they lost some of that handset business from North America, they're trying to quickly find revenues to replace that. And I think focusing on the automotive sector was one of the ways they were thinking of doing that.
That's super helpful just to get an understanding of the different buckets. So why is Xiaomi doing so well then, actually? Because, I saw a Xiaomi car, I think maybe last year when I visited Beijing. It's very sleek. It feels very nice, but just in comparison to Li Auto, Xpeng, and Neo, which, like you said, they've been around for like more than a decade. They're they're actually beautiful cars. I was quite like shocked when I first saw some of them during COVID time. Yeah, why is it that they're just outbeating them? Is it because of the ecosystem? Is it because what people are talking about with the operating system? Because people can Xiaomi's operating system is just significantly better because their software is better? Or what is it that's driving consumers buy them over others?
So there's a few things going on with Xiaomi. So the SU7, which is their sedan, if you squint, it kind of looks like a Porsche Taycan. And then the
It
U7,
does.
which is yeah, so that helps, I think. And then the U7, which if you squint looks a little bit like a Ferrari Puro Sangue, which is their Ferrari UV or FUV. So they have borrowed design language from these two amazing automotive brands, and that's helped them. But they have offered these vehicles at less than 40 US thousand dollars, starting at $40,000 with features that are very, very technology forward. And one of the big reasons they're successful is I bet, Grace, if I looked around your apartment, I would probably see a Xiaomi product, one or two at least. And in China, I didn't know anyone that did not have some sort of Xiaomi air purifier, rice cooker, TV, computer, mobile phone. So the brand is ubiquitous in China. And that really helped Xiaomi when the vehicles launched create this automatic instant demand because the brand is there's complete awareness of the brand and there's a lot of trust amongst Chinese consumers. And one of the important things about the China market versus the rest of the world is that anyone born after 1990 in China is a digital native. So they grew up with WeChat, Didi, Meituan, Alibaba, and Xiaomi. So, and these are all Chinese brands. So they trust Chinese brands, not like their parents who only bought foreign brands. And I think that's the larger shift in the Chinese market across sectors, consumers goods, technology, consumers products, now automotive. But also Xiaomi is very well connected across different, product segments. They have an app that controls everything. It extends into the vehicle, and you would call that a consumer focused product company. And I think that resonates with a lot of Chinese consumers. So the impact that they've made is enormous. I haven't even talked about how cool the cars are and what they're able to do. They're breaking records at one of the most historic racetracks in Germany, the Nürburgring, and they're beating the pants off of Porsche. So if I'm Porsche and I know that Xiaomi is entering the European markets, Germany in 2027, I'm pretty worried because Porsche is not doing well in the China market. And I think that's the canary in the coal mine for a lot of companies in Europe, that Xiaomi is going to be a major player as long as they can continue to build these cool cars.
Super interesting. I would want to I want to talk about Chinese vehicles, Chinese EV companies going global and going to Europe later. But to start, I want to talk about the hype that BYD gets as well. Some of them cost less than even 100,000 RMB. What is it about BYD and how to understand them from a business perspective as well? Like they create their own batteries. They are getting into semis. They have their whole integrated industrial platform. Like, help us understand BYD.
BYD's story is amazing. In 2009, my first day in Beijing, there were BYDs. I got into, I want to say, a BYD cab, and it wasn't great. It was not good. The doors were very thin. You could hear the outside world pretty clearly, and I wasn't feeling that safe in the vehicle, to be honest with you. But fast forward to 2026, and let's just look at the last 7 or 8 years. Before COVID, BYD was shipping less than a million units. They're at 4.6 in 2025. Will likely get to 5 million. They're going to be exporting about a million of those, a little over a million of those. So they're in over 100 markets currently. So they are uber aggressive. And to your point, they're very vertically integrated. BYD started out as a technology company that supplied batteries and other components to companies like Apple and I want to say like Intel, but they got their experience and their scar tissue from working with some of the toughest technology companies, and that's really kind of created this resilience and ability to grow and scale and stay aggressive. Now they created a monster because companies like Geely and companies like Leap Motor are right on their heels, and they're actually not doing that well. Their growth is flattening out, and the competition in China is super, super intense, hence the importance of them to export. Wang Chuanfu is the founder CEO, and Stella Li is the head of international. they've made it clear that they're targeting Toyota to become the largest automaker in the world. And 3 years ago, they were going to be number 1 with a bullet, but now we're seeing as they scale and that denominator gets much bigger, double-digit growth is much harder to come by. Competition is catching up. They created the competition. They really, really were catalyst for all these other companies to build these sub $100,000 or sub 100 RMB cars that are pretty amazing. Now, you make a great point because in China, BYD is the mass market value car, okay? But it creates an entry point for Chinese consumers that wouldn't otherwise be able to purchase a vehicle, especially in big cities like Beijing and Shanghai, where it's, getting a license plate is a challenge, and then finding parking and being able to pay for that is also very challenging, especially if you live right in city center. And BYD has really, I think, in 10 years, 15 years, will point to BYD to the as a democratizer of many, many, many things, not just mass market clean energy vehicles. And their focus on going international really, really put them behind a little bit on the technology curve. And companies like an Xpeng are leaning into the technology. And Wang Chuanfu has acknowledged that they're a little bit behind on some of the features that other Chinese automakers are providing in the China market. But he's determined with his over 100,000 engineers to really push that envelope to catch up and surpass some of their domestic competitors. Recent examples of that, they're launching a megawatt charger, or they've launched a megawatt charger in the China market. And that's basically charging as fast as gas. You can charge full within 6, 7, 8 minutes. And then also recently, just last week, I want to say, their intelligent driving system is called God's Eye, and they are now providing a year's worth of insurance if there are any accidents while you're using God's Eye in China. So they're putting their money where their mouth is. You don't see Tesla doing that. And so they are willing to take that next step that everyone else begrudgingly has to follow them on. And, one of the important things I'd mentioned 10 years, we'll say they've democratized things. The other thing is they're offering God's Eye as standard on many of their vehicles. And so think of it from the standpoint of not only in China, but to your point, now in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in Latin America, these people that have a 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 US dollar car, they might be able to drive themselves or at least have portions of the road where the vehicle has intelligent driving capabilities. And if BYD doesn't do that, intelligent driving doesn't happen in those emerging markets for 10, 15 years at least. So they're really, really pulling, I think, begrudgingly, a lot of their competitors forward on that technology curve, and I applaud them for that. Now, at 4.6 million to get to 11 million, I think Wang Chuanfu and Stella Li appreciate more the level of management capability and the operational efficiency needed, like by a Toyota, to get to 11 million units. And so, but they've doubled down, and it sounds like they're still determined to be a top 2, top 3 player in the next 5 to 7 years.
That's really interesting that you pointed something out, which I didn't notice at all. It's the fact that they're democratizing the technology. So it'll be very interesting that they will actually introduce the kind of next generation technology to these markets. So I guess bringing down their price right now is a long-term strategy because once you capture that, mind share, that they can always increase their prices later on.
So one of the most important things, Grace, is that there are 2 emotional buys in a person's life generally, and that's a house and a car.
Yeah.
And in China, I think there's around 60 hours, I want to say, of research being done online, at the retailer, test driving, before you actually pull the trigger and buy something. And so if you and I don't know if you have an iPhone or an Android phone, but if you lost your iPhone tomorrow, you'd be upset, but you'd walk into an Apple store and buy another one right away. But a car, people take consideration because it's a reflection of who you are, who you want to be, and really outside of your home and office, you spend most of your time in the cars, especially if you live in Asia. And so that's why it's so important for them to be in these markets as a first mover. They create that awareness first, they build that trust first, and it helps them elbow out other players that might have equally impressive products, but because they came 2 or 3 years later, BYD already is in the mindset of a lot of these international consumers, especially in the emerging markets where a lot of times they'll enter and 6 or 7 months later, they're the number one brand in this segment, in that segment, or these segments that they enter.
Definitely. So let's bring it back to traditional OEMs. You worked with some of them, or you worked at some of them. Why did traditional automakers struggle to build compelling EVs now, especially, in China? The factories are there, the people were there. Like you said in the beginning, you said some of them became a little bit complacent about the idea that, Chinese consumers maybe just really liked luxury cars from Europe. The default was buying Japanese cars for families. Why is it that almost every traditional OEM has produced a kind of crappy EV version?
At the end of the day, Grace, a lot of it has to do with. So let me first qualify this by saying if you ever talk to someone that tells you they predicted that the market was going to move quickly over to clean energy vehicles in China, do not believe them because no one could have predicted how fast the market moved over. In 2020, we were 2019, we're at like 1.2 million units of NEVs relative to a 22 million unit base. Okay. And then in 2020, we were like 1.3. Then we got to 3.5, we got to 6.5, we got to 9 million. And last year we were close to 11 and a half, 12, 13 million units. And so we are currently over one of the inflection points, over 50%. So one of every two cars is an NEV sold in China. Okay. And no one could have predicted that. So everyone was caught flat-footed if you're a foreign automaker. Now, let's add in the fact that they're analog companies, right? They're not software companies, they're not technology companies. And I bet today, if you and I were to go into a boardroom or any meeting room in Detroit or Dearborn or Auburn Hills or Stuttgart, they're still talking about the product. Okay. If we look at Neo, Xpeng, Li Auto, their founders come from tech. Okay. They iterate, they don't, they ship product that's good enough and then they figure out what the bugs are and then they create over there updates to fix those bugs. And whereas traditional automakers, they try to wring out as much profit as they can over a 5-year period. And that's because traditional product development cycles are a 5-year period or a 4-year period. The best company on the legacy side is Toyota, and they're at around 30 months. Most good Chinese EV companies like a BYD or Zeekr, they can go from clean sheet to job one. And job one means the first sellable vehicle off the production line. They can do that in about 15 months, which is absolutely insane. Now, they don't have the blinders on that say we can only do it a certain way. They've challenged everything all the way through. Simple things like where you might be, a product engineer or a component engineer, and you throw it over to me as a manufacturing engineer. Everything's in serial. That's why it takes so long sometimes. The Chinese EV makers, they do a lot of things in parallel. They simulate a lot of safety tests, validation to engineering validation tests, manufacturing validation tests. They simulate a lot of that stuff and it shrank the timelines. And they treat manufacturing like a technology as opposed to, an analog product. And if I'm being frank and honest, and I know that you want me to be that, the Volkswagens, the GMs, the Mercedes, the BMW, they're busy back in their home markets counting their money for a long time. These narratives that they steal IP. Is there IP theft? I think you and I would agree. Yes, there is IP theft in China. But if let's qualify that. If there was IP theft in this instance, the Chinese automakers would make great IC engines, right? Like gas engines.
But they don't.
You would think.
But they don't.
Exactly. So in this particular case, it wasn't because they stole this IP, and it wasn't because of subsidies, because there have been subsidies since 2009, and it has been a substantial dollar figure, right? Tens of billions of dollars, if not hundreds. But if we look at a Tesla has not sold a vehicle globally without some form of subsidy. Okay, full stop. They got their factory in Fremont for next to nothing. Shanghai Giga, tons of incentives by the local government. Li Qiang put that deal together. Guess what? He's now the vice premier of China. So that was probably one of the reasons he got that promotion. So the idea that Chinese subsidies bad, US subsidies good, European subsidies good, that needs to just stop. And at the end of the day, if you have those subsidies, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to win, because you probably remember this, Grace. Xpeng, Li Auto, Neo in 2016, 2017, 2018, they were struggling. They're almost bankrupt. And it wasn't until December of 2019 where the first Model 3 rolled off the line in Shanghai Giga that you really saw that hockey stick inflection point. Okay. So despite all the subsidies, despite all these promising EV startups, it took Tesla to really bring excitement to that market. And so you can credit Tesla for being the catalyst for EVs globally, not only in the United States, but China. I think we should acknowledge that they're a huge part of why EVs became a thing in China. Now, because of the competition, all of these competitors came in because of the subsidies, because of the R&B that was being given out by local governments. You had a ton of players come in. And last year, it got so competitive that the Chinese government was like, no mas, no mas, no involution. And so we have to acknowledge that the China market across a number of sectors, not just automotive, is likely the most brutal automotive market in the world. And if you're able to survive out of this mess, you're going to be a very, very formidable competitor outside of the China market.
Definitely there's the Musk effect, I think, on, Tesla bringing out EVs, and now we're seeing that with humanoids as again, because with Elon Musk obsessing with humanoids, we're seeing the world obsessing with humanoids. We'll talk a bit about that later. I appreciate you giving kind of the backdrop of the history of China's EV space. Tell us about the industrial policy push though, because you mentioned subsidies as a very like vague term, but what kind of subsidies or industrial push do you think China actually gave this industry to bolster it?
The Chinese government has the ability to long-term plan. That doesn't happen in the United States, unfortunately, and it's really costing us in a lot of areas and sectors. And we're seeing these sectors that would normally be pretty strong, be pretty competitive, struggle against the Chinese. But let's say in 2009, the Chinese government looked at manufacturing as a pillar industry that supported jobs, and within the manufacturing sector, they wanted to become number one in batteries, number one in silicon fabrication, not only silicon design, but silicon fabrication, automotive, EV manufacturing, and then and that all supports this notion that they're the world's factory. Okay, and they double down on that. Now, the types of subsidies, whether it's tax abatements for land, whether it's discounts on building factories, whether it's purchase subsidies or tax abatements for the consumer who don't have to pay taxes on buying EVs. To your point, in Hong Kong, same thing, right? Similar things going on. I wanna stress that anywhere in the world, emerging technologies, in order for them to become really ubiquitous and blossom, governments need to put their thumbs on the scale. Okay. So it's not just a Chinese thing. The United States was ready to give consumers $7,500 for every EV that they bought. Okay. So it's not just a China thing. Norway, which has a ton of oil money. Use that oil money to subsidize EVs. And now the take rate in Norway is over 90%. Now their market is tiny, 400, 500, 600,000 units a year, but nonetheless, it's another example of the government putting their thumb on the scale. When you look at Germany and other parts of Europe, they also subsidized EV purchase. And that's also when you saw growth rates a little bit higher than they are now because they've taken away a lot of those subsidies. So again, emerging technologies need help. And normally the governments in any one of these countries needs to step in. The exception is kind of the UK, which has done pretty well on EV adoption, the growth of EV adoption, despite not having a ton of subsidies on the consumer side. But that being said, these subsidies, this focus, this diligence, this perseverance, this investment over time, it didn't look like, let's say 2010, 2012, 2014, it didn't look like it was going to really, really work out that well. And then all of a sudden, COVID happens, and you get this huge spike in demand for electric vehicles or clean energy vehicles or new energy vehicles. Now,
Why is
a
that?
quick story. You know,
Because like we're
it's
locked in
it's
our
a
homes, so why do we need EVs?
it's a weird phenomenon, and I haven't read anything or talked to anyone that can. We can try to theorize. For me, it's like, yes, we're locked in. I wouldn't say we're locked in our homes, but we're locked in the country, and we don't travel. So maybe we spend money on something that we think might make us happy or something like that, right? Like, I can't tell you why outside of, okay, Tesla starts building in 2020. And a quick story about my COVID experience. My family went back to Michigan. So I was sending my kids to a local school. So they had basically the month of January off in 2020. We were going to go back to the United States for 3 weeks to visit family. And the 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 return flight was canceled after 2 weeks in the US because China was starting to have COVID, and we bought two one-way plane tickets that were canceled, and then a third one where we finally got to fly into Narita, stay there a night, fly into Shanghai, and then to Beijing, and then quarantine for 2 weeks. And we didn't leave China for 2.5 years at that point. The day after we got back, the Chinese government closed the border. And during that time, Grace, you saw more and more and more of these green plates. And I was just amazed because think of all of the things that need to happen for demand and supply to work together. Because it's not just, okay, we can produce these things, no problem. There needs to be charging infrastructure. Batteries need to be scaled up to support, the EVs. And then creating this awareness, creating this excitement. The Neos and Xpungs and Li Autos weren't able to do it on their own. The BYDs weren't able to do it on their own. But on the backs of the Chinese consumers really, really trusting the Tesla brand. And we've seen that the Tesla brand in China market is extremely resilient because they're still selling quite a few despite not upgrading their vehicle or updating their vehicle in a number of years. And so it is a strange phenomenon that I can't definitively tell you why. I just know I saw more and more green plates when I was in Beijing and Shanghai over 2020 through 2024 or 2022. So
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. And like every single tech founder or AI founder I've ever met basically says they drive a Tesla. So, contrary to what you were saying earlier, you're like, a lot of Chinese younger generation actually prefer the Chinese consumer brands. There's something about Elon Musk and his brand in China. People like love it, worship it, want to become him, whatever. So, all the founders and tech people still drive Tesla. I want to bring it to the next point, which is on AI and tech, actually. So we talked about EVs, and I know I can ask you like 3,000 more questions on this, but I want to understand the AI element to all of this now, because essentially EVs are not like old cars. They are tech first cars, right? Like you said. But because of they are tech first cars, they seem to have integrated AI or hardware plus software much more seamlessly. We're seeing like Li Xiang push out like even wearables like glasses that can control their cars. We all know all the mentioned brands just now have voice control. They all have some sort of AI already embedded in them. Now it's just like giving them a more formalized name. Autonomous driving obviously is a form of AI. We can talk about that as well. But help us understand for people for these cars, are these kind of like software, hardware integrated really that seamlessly, or are they struggling as well? And then on top of that, you've said something, I think, in one of the podcasts before, is that you push back on the phrase software defined vehicle. You say that's wrong. Explain that to us.
So the terms mobile phone on wheels and software defined vehicles, to me, and I would love your opinion on this, Grace, that tells me that these people don't know technology or understand technology or have worked in the technology space, because software doesn't define anything. Software, AI, silicon, these are all tools that create a compelling user experience. You put them together, you design them well, you you combine them with the right hardware and the software that instructs the hardware what to do, when to do it, how fast to do it. That creates the user experience. And I'm an Apple alum, so I learned that early on. It was really, really drilled in my head that the user experience, the stickiness, that creates the brand, that creates the brand loyalty. Okay. And what the Chinese automakers are doing right now is like throwing spaghetti on the wall to see what sticks. And because of the enormous pressure on competition, they just try to be first. Okay. What likely they need to do, and I don't know if they're going to be able to do this in the next 18, 24 months, just because I don't see competition really, really slowing down in the China market, is take a step back. I had a conversation with Sam Livingstone and Matt Vogue talking about the Ferrari Luce and some of the missteps. And part of that is, what does this mean to the Neo brand? What does this mean to the Xpeng brand? Because that is what creates the awareness, the trust and the loyalty. Is like everything just kind of makes sense. Simple design is really, really, really hard. Johnny Ive has said that many, many times. And I'm sure I would again love your opinion, because I'm a Westerner, so I'm not used to Chinese apps that have a million things popping up at me, or Chinese websites that have all these windows and all these lights blinking and stuff like that. It's a little intimidating to me, and I feel like front consoles of Chinese EVs are still a little bit overwhelming. Now, if we look at a Xiaomi, I think they do it pretty well. They can improve, but they have years and years of experience among their teams to build out consumer experiences. Okay. And to me, like, the reason I don't like mobile phone on wheels, because a mobile phone can't run you over and kill you. Okay. So anything automotive grade is a completely next level thing. So a big thing on the battery side is energy storage systems. Okay. A battery for an energy storage system is not automotive grade. It needs to be bulletproof if it's automotive grade. So the level of engineering and manufacturing quality needs to be much, much higher. That's why when we oversimplify it like that, I don't think people appreciate the amount of effort and level of detail that needs to be had for putting something on automotive grade. And then software defined, again, it tells me that these guys think software is the end all be all. If software, AI, and hardware is running great, you don't notice it. You just have a great experience. If I have to say this hardware is not working or that hard, then the automotive the designers and engineers need to go back to the drawing board, because something's wrong. Uh, and that's why I want to emphasize, being an Apple alum, that hardware and software integration is what is going to create and differentiate you in the market long term. And one thing I will point out about Apple is that because they have a closed system and they don't have to Frankenstein a bunch of disparate, firmware together, because they control the design of the hardware and the software, and integrating. Well, they might integrate third-party AI now because they're super behind, but that's kind of the only third-party thing that they're doing. But eventually, I'm sure they're going to look to create a native AI support system for their ecosystem. But I think that's the huge differentiator. Now, is it realistic for an automaker to have a closed system and control so much? If you're Tesla, maybe, but you started on day one as a closed system. Okay. It's going to be extremely difficult for most other automakers to do this. Now, one of the areas I think you wanted to talk about were partnerships. And this is where the Chinese automakers are getting a lot of credit through the announcements of all these partnerships with their Western counterparts. And the important thing is that there have always been partnerships in the China market. It's been a requirement of the Chinese government historically, now with the exception of the Tesla factory in Shanghai recently. But now these partnerships are bleeding into Europe, they're bleeding into North America, and we'll continue to see that as long as the Chinese are pushing the envelope on innovation. But again, Grace, can the legacy automakers use somebody else's tools? Again, they're tools. Can they use somebody else's tools to create a Volkswagen experience, a Volkswagen brand experience that historically is this way or that way? Okay, like you trust Volvo, right? You don't like their new cars, but if Volvo is using Geely software, Geely AI, Geely hardware, or like Geely qualified hardware, is it still going to feel like a Volvo to you? And I think those are kind of the important things moving forward that's going to differentiate some of the legacy automakers and some of the better Chinese EV makers from the rest of the field.
I feel like listening to you explain this actually make me feel like there's going to be two fragments of the market where the hardware people, like the people who still want the best hardware experience, will still go with a traditional OEM because you will still get the best craftsmanship, get the best kind of hardware experience, right? But if you are going to go for AI native experience as we go forward with this, you want the best voice control, you want the best whatever interaction with your AI agent in within your car, then it would make, like you said, it would be extremely hard for a Volvo to use someone else's software. So wouldn't a company with their own software actually have the advantage of building that? So like a Xiaomi or Tesla, right? Like your point, you have your closed ecosystem, you have your existing software, you have everything you need to make the experience better. But that said, the car might not be as sleek as a Audi, Mercedes, whatnot, right? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that when you get to clean energy vehicles, especially battery electric vehicles, manufacturing is simplified by orders of magnitude. So the GMs, the Volkswagens, the Porsches, Mercedes, they all have entire powertrain divisions that only work on the engine. Imagine those entire departments effectively going away. Okay. Electric motors, and I'm oversimplifying this, but they're fairly commoditized. Okay. They're super fast, super efficient, generally speaking. Automotive grade is something different than everything else, again. But that is really going to be the differentiator moving forward. Grace, if I told you that in 15 to 17 years, maybe less than that, building a car is going to be commoditized. So there's no value in that aspect or part of it. Now, with the world being as bifurcated as it is, especially in North America that doesn't want Chinese battery cells in North American vehicles for now, maybe it's a longer timeline, but effectively, China is really, really creating or forcing other companies to rethink how they manufacture things, how they develop things. And the spaghetti on the wall, there will be some spaghetti that sticks for the Chinese automakers. And you better believe that copycatting is going to be reversed now. The Europeans and the North American car companies are really going to create their own versions of X, Y, and Z. Now, can we say that it was innovated and perfected in the China market? Probably moving forward in the next 3, 5, 7 years. But we also need to look at the demo, right? Because you had mentioned some people want performance, some people want the digital experience. And I think a lot of that is going to correlate to what the demographic is, because a BMW Mercedes owner in China is around 20, 25 years old, younger than in Europe and North America. As a, as an old man, I have different needs than you do, as a young woman. So what I like in a car is going to be different than what you like, than what your husband likes, than what my wife likes. And I think that's where the Chinese are going to have to play the global game. Okay. Now they need a a solid foundation of extremely high sales in their domestic market to create the flexibility to sell abroad and to sell at a premium abroad. But are all these digital features and technological advancements going to resonate with a 60-year-old European man in Germany who is used to driving a BMW? Probably not. Okay. But one of the other big advantages is that the Chinese have is, and I'll give you a quick example. Friend Nick Carey, who writes for Reuters, last year he wrote an article about Chery taking 6 weeks to change the suspension and steering system in an Omada 5, because they were shipping the China spec version of the Omada 5 to Europe, and the Europeans were like, yeah, this steering is way too mushy and the feel isn't there. The Europeans will not like this. And so over 6 weeks, they qualified new parts, they updated the software through OTAs and firmware, and then shipped the new product. And that would take a year, in at least a year at most legacy automakers, because of the layers of bureaucracy, the approvals needed. But this was done in 6 weeks. Now that's also a reflection of the
Does that not frighten
996 in
you a little
China.
though? Because like how fast, like you mentioned, how fast they ship. I want to ask something slightly sensitive. Then, what about the safety of these cars, right?
Well, if you asked the Chinese automakers, they will assure you that they're not cutting corners. Okay. And I have driven many of these Chinese cars. Now, I haven't owned one for 10 years. So long term efficiency and safety, I don't know. Most people don't, because a lot of these cars have been on the road for less than 5 years. But when you talk to the automakers, and again, a lot of these people come from the automotive space. A lot of the leadership of some of these Chinese companies, they come from the Mercedes, the Volkswagen groups. And so they do have some visibility into how things are being done differently. But I would also counter what you just said with, yes, there's a little bit of risk with cutting so quickly the product development and so severely the product development cycle. But also how things traditionally work at large conglomerates and even governments is, there's something new that's happening, we'll add a layer. There's something new happening, we'll add a layer. Technology changes, we'll add a layer. So no one ever takes a step back and say, these 15 layers, does this still make sense? Because I mean, that's kind of the definition of bureaucracy, right? So time will tell. I feel not safe in these cars? No.
No, I
And
was
I've
playing
driven
devil's
dozens
advocate.
of
Like
them. So
I've been in so many of these in China and, especially across Asia, but I just think it's just people tend to ask questions like, oh, it's so short then. If you're shipping them out within a year, what kind of corners are you cutting? And then thus the question is easy to say. The next question is it safe, right? But I think I kind of feel you on that point. If it's completely new, if you treat it like a startup, it's innovative, there's a lack of bureaucracy, there's a lack of this is how we do things, then you actually can just get things done much faster. I'm mindful of time. I want to ask you some questions beyond the traditional car makers and whatnot. Help us understand where China is with autonomous driving right now. Who are the main players, and just roughly understand, who are the ones kind of competing with Waymo, who's Pony AI, right? Like who's WeRide. I know, again, it's a
let me
super big question, but let me just throw this to you like open ended.
let me kind of close out that last topic that we were talking about with food for thought, and something that I know you know as well, but maybe your audience isn't quite aware of. If any Chinese company is found to be cutting corners in the China market, the Chinese government would not look kindly on that, and there would be severe consequences, right? So I think there's this healthy fear of, if we are cutting corners and we're found out, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. There's not going to be years of litigation. There's going to be severe penalties right away. And I think that healthy fear motivates many of these Chinese automaker leadership to stay on the right path. Right now, again, time will tell. But to pivot towards your question about autonomous vehicles, so Waymo is the global standard. I think most people would acknowledge that. They're in many markets. They're entering foreign markets. But there, to your point, there's WeRide, there's Pony, and then there's Baidu. These are the three largest players in China currently. But then
I do call Polo, right? Or
Apollo Go, yep,
yeah.
and unfortunately, when I was in Beijing last month or 2 months ago, uh, Apollo Go was not running because in Wuhan, about 1,000 of them or 100 of them were on the roads, and they just turned into bricks right on the roads. And so they had stopped the pilot programs. I don't know if they're running again, but I normally, when I'm back in China, will try out all these systems for the latest software to make sure, to just kind of see, feel, understand what's going on. And what's unique about China is that the feel is a little bit different in each of these cities, just because how people drive is so different in different
This is
cities.
something I feel
You
like
know,
no one understand if you don't live, you haven't lived in China. Like people in Beijing are just aggressively wild. Like people don't
you
realize
think
this.
they're aggressive? Man, so I've driven in
What?
like Changsha, I've driven in these tier 2
Oh, I
cities,
haven't
and you're
driven in
like,
tier two cities. I usually just get a car there. Like I already think Beijing is so terrifying. Like I started driving 16 years old in Canada and I refuse to drive in Beijing. And because you stop the car for someone to pass. Next thing you know, like 10 cars have passed, like 20
my
bikes
goodness.
past you, 30 pedestrians, and you're still there, and then there's like 20 people behind you honking you, and you're just like, oh
Yeah, so
yeah.
a quick funny story. My wife used to be very worried because I would get super fired up when I'm driving in China. I For some reason I learned to compartmentalize it because I would get super upset, and then when I got out of the car, I would just not be upset. I don't know how I did it, but because my
Like you
wife
have
didn't
to.
want me to take. Yeah, I it was
Because you're like
just.
constantly road raging.
And
Anyway.
so what you're talking about is called cutting in. And if you have a meter of space between you and the car ahead of you, someone will cut in. Someone will cut in for sure. And if you're not used to that, and then someone will cut in, and then there will be a sanlonche delivery vehicle that turns the opposite way, and your head needs to be on a swivel, and it is quite an experience. It's similar, and I won't say similar, but it has a similar feel as like Southeast Asia because it's so crazy, and it just kind of works in Southeast Asia, and it doesn't work super well in China because there's traffic jams all over the place. But Pony and WeRide are trying to help some of that stuff. Let me segue to
But yeah,
that.
so how does it work though? Like that's my point. Like how do these autonomous driving, like these cars work if, people are so non-predictable? The whole idea is they're supposed to predict what the car is going to do, but they just like zigzag and people just pop out of nowhere. Like is it safe? Like what's really holding up? Like what's a bottleneck of deploying these at scale right now? Is it regulation, is it technology, or is it just like craziness of the roads?
So let me again. Let's do 30,000 foot level. We ride Pony. They're both publicly traded in the West, and so I think there are Western investors that know who they are. They're not as large as a Baidu Apollo Go, which has I want to say well over a few thousand cars on the road in China, pilot programs in a dozen cities. But Pony and WeRide are also moving aggressively outside of China, partnering with Uber, partnering with other companies, ride hailing companies. And there's pressure because they're publicly traded to really scale and create some profitability, whereas Waymo is still owned by Alphabet. So I think they have internal pressure, but not pressure from external markets. And the difference between China in the US because at the end of the day, these are really the only two players that have multiple horses in this race. Now, in the UK, there's a company called Wave, and I think there would be other European players that would argue that, hey, we're also a major player, but let's, for the intents and purposes, oversimplify this by saying there's the US and the Chinese players. In China, there is this first wave of AV companies, the WeRides, the Ponies, the Baidus, and then there's this other wave, and we're only talking about robotaxis. Because on the commercial trucking side, on the slow moving delivery vehicles, we also have autonomous vehicle players. But for robotaxis, there's this second wave, and they're more of an asset light company, autonomous vehicles startup. So like Deep Route, Momenta, QCraft, what they're doing is partnering with traditional OEMs in China to get their stacks onto these vehicles. Deep Route, for instance, working directly with Great Wall to integrate their hardware software stack into the design of the vehicle. So even before, because what we normally see right now, Grace, is a car with lidar, sonar, radar bolted on as a an afterthought. But once these companies are working with the traditional OEMs, they can design them, and it looks like part of the form of the vehicle as opposed to like this bolt on after the fact. And the convergence between robotaxi company and traditional OEM is blurring. And I'd mentioned earlier that Huawei also has a significant stack. So they're a player as well. But Huawei, as far as I know, is not getting into the robotaxi space, but they're going to move into level 3 intelligent driving, and they're hoping to be in millions of vehicles in China within the next few years. And that's where it's very different in China because there's not a lot of convergence going on in the US market. Now, we know about Neuro, we know about Zoox, we know about Waymo, and with the exception of a Neuro who's working with Lucid to put their stack on the Gravities for a premium experience, most of these companies are not working with OEMs, and then the OEMs have their own systems as well. And that's the big difference between the China market and the US market. And what we'll likely see is a bifurcation of the US market being primarily North American autonomous vehicle providers working with the Ubers and the Lyfts to create that larger install base to try to reach a broader audience. And that's one of the big reasons why these companies are working with the ride hailing companies, because it's going to be hard for Pony to attract 100 million users. Whereas if I partner with Uber, my install base is 160 million global users. And so that creates an opportunity. And I think long term, Uber sees robotaxis and eVTOL as their profit drivers. And the delivery services and all these ancillary mobility services as a way to increase their install base but not make a ton of money. And
But
and
wouldn't
so
that cannibalize their own business, existing business a little bit?
yeah, that's the $1 million question, because Uber is now also buying its own autonomous vehicles. So not only is it a ride hailing platform, but it's a fleet manager now. And that
It's
changes the
hedging.
economics of their, yeah, exactly. So that really changes the economics on their balance sheet. Okay. So I don't, to your point, I do think they are kind of hedging their bets a little bit, because if, to answer your question, we should separate autonomous vehicles into those that use lidar and those do not use lidar. Tesla does not use lidar. Wave, which is the UK company based out of London, does not use lidar. Now, we can have, and I'm sure well, I think you're talking to some expert in a couple of weeks, so maybe you can ask them to lidar or to not to lidar. They are using lidar, so I'm sure he'll say that lidar is necessary, but
Jazz.
it's more philosophical now, right? It's more philosophical because Tesla can't all of a sudden put lidar because it changes their whole system. Okay. But to me, lidar prices have gone down so significantly that creating another redundancy and kind of creating that sensor fusion with multiple sensors and LiDAR creates more a safe environment, I would think. But again, it's an interesting thing that I don't think a lot of
Like, it's a
people
philosophical
definitively
choice, you
can
said?
answer. I'm
You said
sorry?
it's a philosophical choice, or is it actually a design choice? Because the vehicle already can, like, you cannot put a lidar on top of it because Teslas cannot use lidars. Like, is there a reason?
Well, so it to me, it was a engineering choice at first, but now it's more philosophical because now you need to change your system if you all of a sudden incorporate LiDAR into it, right? And for Elon, I think it's also a Mienza thing because he's been so strong against
Yeah.
LiDAR that if he turns it around now, don't get me wrong, he says things sometimes that never come true or haven't come true yet. So that's kind of the crazy thing. But I think LiDAR, that's one of those things where I think he's willing to die on that. That Tesla does not need LiDAR. But anyways, I don't want to get into this
Okay,
discussion
it's
about
getting too
LiDAR,
technical. Alright.
but to the bifurcation thing, the reason I say bifurcation is because we know that Europe has a strong data security, data sovereignty policy, security, privacy, and sovereignty. So, will Europe allow the Chinese autonomous vehicle makers to ship European data back to China to the servers to train the models? And or so the United States, because we have a ton of allies, China has a ton of allies. That's why it's likely that the Chinese allies would use the Chinese systems first, and then the U.S. allies would incorporate the
I
Waymos and
see.
the Zooks and the Neuros. That's kind of, and I'm oversimplifying this, but because the Trump administration has kind of poked the eye of a lot of our traditional allies, so maybe they wouldn't want our autonomous vehicles on their roads. But I've ridden in
Yeah, like, Canada might be
all of
saying
these
no these days.
systems.
Sorry, I'm
Yeah,
just like,
yeah.
it's,
No,
like,
you're
really late for me, and I'm just thinking about, yes, but, like, now Canada's gonna have Chinese EVs. Now American cars not gonna sell there. Now American Waymo's not gonna
well,
be in Canada.
we could do an entire episode about
Yeah,
all of
yeah,
that stuff just between North America, right? So I think that
yeah.
would be an interesting conversation. But, you know, that's exactly my point, right? Like traditionally, prior to Trump, I think Waymo was going to rely on our allies to be able to launch its services. And if we look at the Middle East and India, they kind of want to be Switzerland a little bit. Like they don't want to choose. And so that's why you see the kingdom building Lucids, but also investing in Neo. So because they don't want to take one side over another. India's the same thing. And these are potential markets where both of them will compete. Famously in London, by the end of this year, early next year, Wave, Baidu, and Waymo will all be testing and rolling out pilots. So next time you're in London, if it's early next year, you might be able to try all three systems on the same streets,
That's pretty
which I think is
crazy.
going to be a very, very, very unique experience because I don't think there's going to be many cities that you're going to be able to do that in over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And, at the end of the day, is it a data thing? Is it who has the most data? Who has the most robust edge case data? Is that ultimately who wins, or does AI really change the game? Because if it's about data, if it's about kind of real world miles, then you would think the Toyotas and the Volkswagens would have a distinct advantage because guess what? They put 11 million cars a year on the road. Okay, so a company like a Deep Route, a company like a Wave would love to work with these companies that have high sales volume. But what is the great equalizer? If you talk to Elon, it's his system because again, everything is closed, everything is native to the Tesla system. FSD is the best intelligent driving system. Is it better than Waymo? And will there ultimately be a convergence between level 3 and then level 4? Can a Waymo system compete directly versus a Tesla? Because, and I don't have answers to that. And that's what makes the industry so interesting because
Mhm.
the politics of things change, the technology changes, and then the commercialization opportunities change as well. And what I do know is that Waymo is backed by one of the most valuable companies in the world, which means that they have a huge check
Resources.
to help them get to scaling. And one other differentiator with Waymo and the rest of the players is that they're really moving into a lot of four-season cities
Hmm.
like Detroit. So next year, Waymo is going to be launching a service. And what we've seen so far is that a lot of these autonomous vehicle companies are launching in Arizona and the Middle East, where guess what? Weather is super predictable and it's pretty one note.
Hmm.
And where the edge cases are, you can look at it like a inverse normal distribution curve. And I'm oversimplifying this, Grace, but the edge cases, so they happen few and far between, but they're likely where the most severe accidents happen. Okay. So it's like there's the
And the
least
T
amount of data available.
and the blizzards.
Exactly.
You got to experience
Right.
that. Yeah.
Severe storms, blizzards, snow, whiteouts. And so what we'll likely see the final frontier being robotaxis, because we'll see commercial trucking from companies like Kodak. Remember a company like Too Simple? Those competitors. We'll see those Aurora. We'll see commercial trucking happen sooner and likely highway to highway. I
Hmm.
divide commercial trucking into like three segments, and that's, intra-city, city to highway, and then highway to highway. There's three
It's just
separate
much
use
more
cases.
predictable. Yeah.
Yeah. And, robotaxis, I think it'll be phased it'll be geofenced for a long period of time. There'll be certain use cases that it makes a ton of sense for robotaxis, but ultimately, in order for this service to become ubiquitous, there probably needs to be more services that have multiple people than one person in a car. And so that's where it's interesting because Waymo just launched the Ojai, which is the Zeekr contract manufactured vehicle, which has multiple seats. And I think that's how Waymo looks towards profitability to get more than one person in an autonomous vehicle and almost looking at it like a bus, a
I was
smaller
just gonna
bus to
ask
get.
actually, like, are we gonna see a redesign of what robotaxis should look like? Because I tried out Waymo when I was in San Fran, and it's like kind of creepy because you still have the driver's seat, but like no one's sitting there, so you're constantly freaked out, like what, you know, if you're not used to it. So like, will we see more like these little boxes or something that will signal to other drivers as well? More obviously, this is a robotaxi versus like a normal car.
For sure, for sure. Right now, there are policies in place that say you have to have a steering wheel, you have to have brakes. But as the autonomous vehicle landscape evolves, we'll probably start to see. And I have a theory, Grace, that more and more cities will limit private passenger vehicles coming into city center. Okay. If we look at Paris, they're investing 300 million euro to make all the boulevards that bleed into the Champs Elysees bike friendly, and they're going to limit private passenger vehicles. And so, especially in Asia, I could see that being, maybe you park or you take the train into the fourth ring road and then you take an autonomous vehicle into city center. And then to get to your office, you take a scooter. Right. So there's these scenarios where I think more and more cities will try to take back some of the streets, some of the roads that bleed into the city center in order to lighten up traffic and take back some of the land. Because if we think about, and we're getting off topic here, but I think these are important kind of secondary and tertiary effects of autonomous vehicles. Look at these parking structures and like these parking lots. We use them from like 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. and then they're not used for the entire rest of the day. It's kind of a waste, to be honest with you. And
That's a
then,
huge
and I'll,
waste.
right. And so if we can take that back, ideally make more housing affordable, make more office buildings or whatever, right? Like round out, make more green space as opposed to having so many parking structures. Hong Kong could use more green space because all they can do is build up. And so
Or
there's a
actually,
lot
I
of
will
opportunity.
defend Hong Kong. Hong Kong has very like only I think like less than 10% of population even have a car because the
Oh,
public
right.
transit is so good. To your point, like
Yes.
there's mini bus, there's a double decker bus, there's like the MTR, everything is walkable. It's and it's really, really, really well planned. And I think a lot of Asian mega cities are like that. Actually, like think of Singapore, think about like Shenzhen, obviously, obvious Shenzhen, where you have like EV buses to EV cars to EV scooters, all for rent, all for access for the like average person on the street, right? So yeah,
I'm going to drill
that does
down
make
on
sense.
that. I'm going to drill down on that because when I was living in Beijing, I was a mobility practitioner. I walked, I rode share bikes, I rode subways, I rode high speed rail.
Beijing is awful though. The Beijing's
Yeah,
worst urban planning. I just want to say.
yeah. Well, I mean, rings around a road is a little weird, but now that I live in the United States, I'm just an advocate because all I do is get in my car and drive everywhere I go. And on the
It's also because you're in
weekends,
Detroit. It makes a
yeah,
difference,
yeah.
right? If you're
Well,
suburbia versus like the middle of like Ring 3 Beijing.
yeah, and I think that's a big difference between like North America and Asia. And I would lump North America and Europe a little bit into because a lot of these cities aren't very big. So to invest in subways and things like that would probably be just a disproportionate expense for the city's budget. Where when you're in China, there are dozens of cities with over a million people, hundreds of cities
Over
over a
like
million
20
people.
million people. Like
Right, right.
couple
And
cities
so
are over. Yeah.
and that's why I think and what's important about China or distinct about China as well is that the automotive sector didn't build out this transportation system
Mm-mm.
because there's a balance of high speed rail to your point. There's a balance of subways, intra-city transportation. But I'm off topic. The autonomous vehicle space is going to be very interesting because our
Very smooth.
is the US government going to restrict silicon? You know?
Mm.
Does because right now NVIDIA basically supplies every automaker with a high-end transport or intelligent driving feature. Okay. But you and I know that the Chinese government is really pushing for companies like Horizon and Black Sesame and Xpeng Neo, they're Huawei, they're all silicon design companies now too. And eventually Nvidia is going to get pushed out. And that's also another bifurcation point as well. So if the Chinese can't catch up to Nvidia and Qualcomm and and some of these other silicon design more established Western silicon design companies, does that mean their AI is not as good? Does that mean it's not as robust? I think these are really open-ended questions that you probably have conversations with your other guests on. So, and I listen to you because that's important to me about understanding other perspectives on that stuff. Because although I understand the chip sector, not to the level where I'm not an AI expert, and so I like I said, I use it as a tool as opposed to the end all be all. But yeah, so
No, appreciate your insights. Really, really appreciate your time. I've definitely taken up more than, I asked for. So to end, I want to ask a question. What is one differentiated view or you think a misunderstanding the world might have of on the topic of China EVs mobility?
I think in 20, 25 years, we're going to look back at this time as a renaissance in mobility because of everything that's happening so quickly and being driven by the competitiveness of the China market. And we're going to see BYD is definitely going to be a player. And, the other thing that I think is really, really important is that I don't believe traditional automotive folks can think outside of their normal way of seeing how the world works through transportation. And the top 10 mobility providers, to me, in 15 years, there might be a handful of traditional automakers, but I see an Uber maybe being a top 10 player. I see a Baidu or a Waymo being a top 10 player, and they don't build cars. But the importance of building vehicles is not going to be it is going to be reduced over time very quickly because of China. And so if you're not providing a value added service in the mobility space, which I think China is going to be able to do at a much more affordable price point, especially in the emerging markets. I think that's where the important thing is, because in the Western markets, the BYDs and the Geelys still have challenges, and customer acquisition costs are much higher in those or those established markets. But in emerging markets, the Chinese are going to try to roll out not only passenger vehicle buy sell and their brand, but they'll probably try to sell a lot of services once they have that sale. And I think that's really going to be that opportunity for the Chinese to really make a name for themselves. Because you know this, Grace, one of the coolest things about the United States for me as an American is that anywhere I go, and you can not like the food, you can not like the coffee, but it's consistent. If I go to a Starbucks in Munich or Vancouver or Toronto, and that's soft power. That's American soft power, right? The Chinese would love to have Chinese brands creating soft power for them, creating aspirational desires to have their products, and so that is going to be the priority for a lot of these entrepreneurs that you and I speak with, because they're as ambitious as Elon. Maybe they don't get covered as much by Western media because their English might not be fluent or whatever, but they shouldn't be underestimated just because they're in China and they're not in the rest of the world yet. And I think that we're going to look back at this time and point to a few Chinese people at the level of being close to Elon. So
Very interesting. Yeah, I think to your point, a lot of the entrepreneurs I speak to these days, they set their eyes on the global market in the first day and they want to set the industry standard. Like that is their goal. And it's no longer about shipping out something cheaper, shipping out something just to make that quick buck anymore. So there's definitely like a sentiment shift, and that confidence is different as well.
it's off the
To
charts. Confidence is off the
Yeah.
charts.
Well, yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate your time. I feel like I need to invite you back for another conversation because, for what I prepared, we can go on for another 2 hours, I feel like. But it is late tonight for me, so I'm going to call it a day. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Grace.